Good afternoon and welcome to this special edition Brussels Times webinar. My name is Dan Sobovitz and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's live discussion about one of the most fascinating fields of medical research, brain health. We'll pick the brains of some of Europe's most acclaimed brain researchers. We'll also try to understand from policymakers what can be done to see more innovation on brain health and at a higher pace. Why brain health, you may ask? Well, to throw a few numbers at you, brain disorders affect almost 180 million people in Europe alone. Other than the suffering, the economic cost of brain diseases is over 800 billion euros per year. That's around the GDP of a country the size of the Netherlands. It's also more than the cost of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes combined. And these figures were collected before the current COVID-19 pandemic, which has of course aggravated the pressure on mental health. So there's a good reason for us to speak about brain health and a good reason to do it now. We urgently need breakthroughs in the way we diagnose and treat brain diseases. To help us understand this complex topic, we're delighted to have with us virtually Professor Gitte Knudsen. I know she's having a bit of issues to connect to us. Hopefully she'll join us in a few short minutes. I'll introduce her anyway. She's the chief physician at the Department of Clinical Medicine, Neurology, Psychiatry, and Sensory Sciences at the Copenhagen University Hospital. I'm sure that in a few minutes we'll manage to get her to connect to us. Paweł, Świeboda, you're the CEO of the Ebrains project and Director General of the Human Brain Project. Hello, Mr. Director General. Professor Pieter Roelfsema is the Director of the Netherlands Institute of Neurosciences. Hello, Professor. And Ms. Diedre Kloen, you're a member of the European Parliament on the Committee of Environment, Public Health and Food Safety. So we gather the best brains on this topic, but we'd also like to hear from you. If you made the effort to register and join us today, we'd also like to give you a chance to contribute to this conversation. As you can see on your screens, you have one column titled Q&A, where you can send in your own questions, one for ideas that you can pitch directly to this panel, and a third one with polls, where we try to get your opinion on some of the topics. Just to get you comfortable with this tool, we always start by asking where you are dialing in from. So I see Brussels is always quite popular. We're on the Brussels Times, Amsterdam, Switzerland, Germany. So we are being watched from different places. I was going to start with Professor Knudsen, but let's see. No, she's not yet with us. So in that case, I'd like to ask you, Director General Świeboda. I mentioned the Ebrains project. Why don't you tell us in a few words what it is and how is it meant to accelerate brain research? What tools do you have? How does it work?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan, and thanks for hosting us today. So Ebrains is an enabler of scientific breakthroughs in brain research. It is a research infrastructure, so we offer scientists a range of tools for their work. Ebrains is being developed by the Human Brain Project. That's an EU flagship, one of the largest scientific programs in the world in brain research that are currently happening. Now, the point is that we want to draw advantages from the major technological improvements which have taken place in the recent years. Let's start from neuroimaging. Well, in neuroimaging, there has been a genuine revolution, and we can now see in 3D, in high resolution, the types of pictures of the neurons and cells which were not available only a few years ago. So that's a big change. There's an equally big change happening in brain atlasing. And we need brain atlases as a type of reference in brain research, because you cannot, by definition, do a scan of an entire brain of everybody, at least in realistic time. Therefore, you need the support of brain atlases. And these atlases are now getting into higher resolution as well, which would enable researchers to look at cells, at cortical layers, at columns, at the type of detail which, again, wasn't seen before. And this is extremely important because, as cancer research has shown, the devil does lie in the details. So only when the molecular level became involved, cancer research findings became more successful, and now they are bringing a lot of improvements in therapeutics. Now, of course, you will ask how much does it take in terms of compute power and storage, and it does take a lot. We offer 70 petabytes of storage for our data sets. We need to use high-performance computing. We are linked with 7 of European supercomputers because we do offer 300 technologies on the platform. So that is an immense amount of computing that needs to take place. We are talking about the brain, one of the most complex phenomena you can possibly study, probably apart from the cosmic space. So this was the what. Let me say a couple of words about the how, because this is very close to our hearts. This means interdisciplinary research above everything else. So what we have is really neuroscientists, clinicians, computer scientists, AI experts working side by side and being part of the same work packages, trying to come up with unisono solutions. So that's the interdisciplinary nature. We're also very proud of the fact that our tools are co-designed by researchers. So this is what I mentioned when I said that Ebrains is being developed by the Human Brain Project. So we have this massive scientific project which is working on a research infrastructure for the future benefit of the next generation of neuroscientists. Our tools are being co-developed by the research community. And finally,
so as you can see, sorry.
Let me say a couple of words.
I was just going to draw your attention to the survey that we're showing to the audience at the same time, which is related to what you're saying, because you're talking about European researchers, I suppose. So everybody on your platform, is it a European or a global platform?
Ours is primarily European, but it has global aspirations. So we are definitely interested in making it a global platform. But first things first, we are starting from the European research community. This is our immediate target, but our objective is for Ebrains to become a go-to research infrastructure also internationally. And if I may, I will make a claim why that would be the case. And this would be because we go deeper and wider than anybody else. Deeper into the brain, that's the question of the high resolution, which I mentioned, which is absolutely crucial, but also wider across the scales, because what is different about the brain is, of course, that it is multi-scale, and successful research on the brain has to be multi-scale as well. So again, we hope to be best in the class. The jury is out, of course. We are in the preparatory phase. We are designing this research infrastructure, but a lot of tools are already available, and there's a growing research community associated with us.
And to recap, some of the tools that you mentioned were computing power, which I understand are very important for brain researchers. That was one. And the interdisciplinary of basically just bringing all these people to work together on the same platform already has its own value for advancing brain research.
Right. So we start really with the data sets because, after all, it's all about data. So we have a treasure trove of about 1,000 data sets on the platform that we make available to the neuroscientific community worldwide. So you can do two things on Ebrains. You can benefit from this richness of data, and you can also bring your own data sets and deposit them on the platform, which is very important as well. And because we offer this high performance computing and storage and high storage capacity, this is quite a high value proposition for a lot of researchers. So that's the starting point. The next point is to get your data curated, because data differs, and it is high quality data which is needed in order for this to be findable and shareable. So we have a very busy and successful curation team doing that. The next basket of tools would be the brain atlases that I mentioned. They are quite unique in the world because of their 3D character and because of their high resolution. Currently, we're aiming at 1 to 20 micrometers. So that's really the type of detail which is unparalleled in the world. And brain atlases are used as this indispensable reference tool in neuroscience. And then moving on, we have the modeling and simulation tools. Simulation is needed because, again, you cannot know everything about each given brain at a given time. So you need to simulate. You need to create these virtual situations in which you study the behavior of neurons, how they interconnect with each other, how they form networks, and how structure relates to function. And then we have some specialized platforms, and for our topic today, brain health, what is primarily important is the medical informatics platform. This is where we do federated data analysis, and we have connected over 30 hospitals to become part of this platform.
And I have spotted some questions on 3D modeling that hopefully I will be able to bring to you later on. But let me move on to Professor Roelfsema. So you have a very exciting and ambitious objective of giving blind people a certain level of vision, which I'm sure that some of our viewers would be very interested in this great project. So can you tell us in a few minutes, how close are you or is your team to reaching this big objective? And if that has anything to do with the Ebrains project, maybe you can tell us what kind of contribution you have seen so far from your perspective on your research. And I see that Professor Knudsen is now with us, so thank you for joining us. I understand there were some technical problems, but now we're all together. But Professor Roelfsema, please.
Yeah, so we have this ambitious goal to create an interface with the visual brain of blind people. So these are people who we're seeing, and so they have the normal visual system developed, but at a later point during their life they lost the vision in their eyes, typically due to a problem in the eye itself. So then the rest of the brain that is waiting for the visual information to arrive is lying dormant, no information comes, and therefore these people, they can't see, which is quite a handicap. And an ambitious goal that we are not the first to have this goal, so that it already exists since the 60s of the previous century, is then to bring information, visual information, back into the brain, skipping the eye. And the way that this can be achieved is by directly interfacing with the visual cortex. So from the eye, the information travels to the cortex, and the cortex, the primary visual cortex, that's the region we're targeting, has a map of outside space. So 2 points in the outside space that are nearby will map onto 2 parts of your brain that are also nearby. So it's really a systematic map of the outside world. If you now put a wire, so we call it an electrode, but it's basically a wire. If you put that in the primary visual cortex and you put a little bit of electrical current on it, then a person, can also be a person who has been blind for several years, will see a dot of light. And it will see a dot of light in the corresponding location in the outside world where the neurons responsible for that outside world position are in the map. So if you would have 1,000 of these wires, which is what we recently implanted in the visual cortex of monkeys, then you can create in 1,000 positions in the outside world dots of light. And you can
almost
now
like
work
a screen,
with
no? Just like a screen is made of different dots, you would put them together into a full image.
Yes, so I like to make the analogy with a matrix board that we all know from a stadium or from the highway. So if you would flash on one bulb on the matrix board, you see a dot. But by creating the dots of light at the appropriate positions, you can create letters or other meaningful information. And in the final product, so our somewhat ambitious goal is to go to humans in about 2 years from now. I hope we'll make it. But in the final product, there will be a camera that is mounted on glasses, then a processor that transforms this camera image into a brain stimulation pattern that will then be played on this matrix board that is embedded in the brain. So this is something that will require careful development, right? Because if you're going to bring this into blind humans, you better make sure that it works and that it's safe and that it will work also for several years. So that is, of course, the development that needs to be done. And you have to make sure that you also position this in the right place. And this is where Ebrains is really of help. Because many of the tools in Ebrains, one of them are the maps of the cortex. And these maps are the maps that we need to create our visual cortical prosthesis. So there's an important contribution from Ebrains to our research. Now you have to realize that this research, we will focus on the visual brain, but it will have many other applications. And for instance, you could also use the electrodes to rate brain activity, rewriting brain activity, we're putting information in the brain. You can also extract information from the brain, which is currently being used for people who are severely paralyzed, so that they can, for instance, communicate again with the outside world or steer a robotic arm with their thoughts. And I think this is really an important moment for science, because these developments are now coming to light. And there are already starting companies. So think of the company of Elon Musk, who is also investing into this. I think this is a really important moment in history where also in Europe we can start developing these technologies.
So you mentioned in about 2 years you will start what's going to happen in 2 years? You will start experimenting already on humans, or?
Yeah, so we have a collaboration with colleagues in Spain, in Elche, Eduardo Fernandez, where we already put a set of electrodes in the brain of somebody who was blind. And the good news was that if we stimulated those electrodes, the person saw dots of light, just as predicted. Only in this patient, there were only 100 electrodes, and they were confined to a small region on the cortex. So we could also only address a region on the outside visual world, but that was very small. So we have to bring this technology to the next phase and make sure that there's a sufficient part of the visual field that is covered with electrodes. So that's one of the challenges. And our goal is indeed to take the next level of this technology and bring it to patients maybe in about 2 years.
So in 2 years, it's already operational to bring it to patients, you say?
Well, that will be a first-in-human
study. That answers the question we asked to the audience before. I don't know if you saw the survey question asking how long was it going to take until we see. Well, blindness resolved is maybe taking it one step further, but some level of stimulation, of visual stimulation to people who lost their sight, you're saying already within a few years from now.
So there are clinical trials also in the US where they start to do this on a much smaller scale with, say, only 60 working electrodes. Our goal would be to bring this to patients. If you do a first-in-human trial, that means that you're going to select 5 or 6 patients to check if this can work before you have a product that you bring onto the market that has an additional development time of several years. So people sometimes ask me, when blind people approach me, when can I be treated? Then I have to be very careful, because you first have to demonstrate that this can work, that it can be safe. And then the next steps to get also from the regulatory bodies the approval that you can safely use this as a medical product, that is still a next level of complexity. So that will take more time.
Okay, so we heard from you about a very specific project. We heard from Director General Świeboda about the platform that helps researchers like yourself. I'd like to turn now back to Professor Knudsen with maybe a more of an overall view of where we stand when it comes to brain research. I know that you've been working for many years on new ways to both diagnose and treat different kinds of brain-related diseases. So just to zoom out a little bit, how advanced are we? The example that Professor Roelfsema just described sounds very promising and almost there, but would you say that this is the case for a broader range of brain-related diseases, or is he more advanced than the rest of this field?
Well, I think it really depends on what brain disorders we are talking about. But in general, I would say that over the last couple of decades, we have seen quite some drastic developments in treatments. But one big field where we really, really need to do more is within the psychiatric disorders, the mental disorders. And one of the reasons why these disorders are so difficult to treat appropriately is really because we have limited knowledge about the brain. And that applies for many different disorders, but particularly for the mental disorders. You can't do a blood test, you can't do an image and decide on the diagnosis based on that. And most likely, one of the reasons for this is the large heterogeneity of these disorders. For instance, take a disorder like major depressive disorder. So depression is a disease that affects many, many people. So perhaps about 15% of all Europeans will at some point during their lives encounter a depressive
15,
disorder.
1,
So it means, sorry?
15,
1, 5.
1, 5.
15, 1, 5. And that means that that there are enormous costs, personal costs, but also societal costs associated with it. Now, what scientists currently, including myself, are thinking at the moment is that perhaps the diagnosis of depression does not cover one disease. Maybe it's really more of a spectrum of different disorders that happen to give the same or sort of the same symptoms. You can, in a certain manner, you can compare it to having a fever. So you can have fever for many different reasons, but before you know exactly what is the reason for the fever, you can't treat it appropriately. And that's where I'm heading now towards the Ebrains goals, because I think that more and more we are now convinced that in order to sort out this heterogeneity and to enable what we call precision medicine, that is to identify subtypes of a given disorder, then we need to collect many, many more data. And that's the way that science is going these days. We've seen it with the genetic revolution. Just think about how the human genome was sequenced. Many, many scientists came together to resolve this huge challenge, and they succeeded. So it was almost like landing on the moon. And I think it's time now for us to be more ambitious with our brains. We should try to work harder on finding out and helping each other to learn more about the brain, and to put together all the efforts we have and use open science for that. So as long as we as individual scientists and medical doctors use our own small cohorts, say we have 100 patients and that's enough for a publication, fine, you can still learn from that. But I really believe that if we want to make huge progress, we need to put our acts together. We need to share our data. We need to change the way that the incentives are made for scientists for their own careers. And that necessitates some suitable platforms where we can really bring our data together in a quality controlled manner and collect more information, just like the geneticists did with the genome.
So first I'd like to pick on what you said, which I find very interesting, that some of the psychiatric diseases that we know, basically we're grouping similar symptoms of different sources, and we don't actually understand that these are different diseases. That I find very interesting. And if I can go back to the beginning of what you said that for these kind of psychiatric diseases we are less advanced. But if platforms like Ebrains exist and the data is becoming more and more available, how come these diseases, which as you said affect such a big proportion of the population, 15%, how come they were kind of left behind and science has not been up to speed to find or to advance in the direction that you were telling us, of understanding exactly the source, the different sources of the same symptoms, so that we can make more progress on it? Where are the bottlenecks?
The bottlenecks are that there is such a huge heterogeneity in these diseases, so that the disorders, it's not consisting of maybe 2 or 3 different disorders. There's so many factors to take into account. So in order to make a big picture of that, to do, say, a kind of pattern recognition, you need to collect many, many data from many, many patients and to do a deep phenotyping and bring those data together to perhaps do some explorative modeling. So perhaps you can identify, say, 7 different subtypes, and then you need to go to a different data set to confirm what you found in the first one. So artificial intelligence is one tool that we are setting our stakes on at the moment, but you also need to be really careful to make sure that you can replicate your findings. And we are in a replication crisis in the sense that we have many papers coming out, many publications, and unless we try to be more strict about how we replicate these things and share our data to make sure that we have the same outcomes, I think it's going to be hard to make a real progress within these psychiatric disorders.
Okay, but it's the complexity, it's the complex nature of these diseases that make it slow, the progress slower, if I understand correctly. It's the fact that there are so many different sources that it's more difficult to advance, even with the more data available, even with the new tools. But I hear from you that at least there's some hope that now...
Yeah.
No, the new tools will accelerate,
even
you're
with
saying.
Tools, because we need to put our data together. That's exactly the solution to this, is that each scientist should bring in their data, and I think Ebrains provides a platform that enables bringing together such data. That's the point here.
So it's not the case yet. So the platform exists, but now we need scientists to actually onboard their data so that everybody can benefit from this data. I understand.
It sounds easy. Well, you could just put your data there, but actually, it's very, very complex. And just getting a line for how you analyze data and what type of data, it's a big task. So it's by no means easy. So in that way, the analogy to the genome is perhaps not the best one, because that is a little bit more straightforward with 4 letters you put in. But psychiatric data can be enormously complicated. How do we measure the severity of a depression? That can be done in many, many different ways, and who knows which one is the best one. So it's a huge task that lies in front of us, but I think it's also the only way forward.
Okay. Well, at least we have new tools that hopefully will help researchers like you. Member of Parliament Knudsen, we just heard about some of the challenges and the opportunities when it comes to brain research. Where does the EU come into this great endeavor? What is the role of the European institutions and your role as a policymaker in the European Parliament? How can you contribute to this great challenge?
Yeah, well, I did, and it was your most interesting, the contributions there, particularly your last contribution on how do we coordinate, how we get to a point where we can share information. And that's where I would see a role that the European Union, or the institutions, can play a really strong role in ensuring that we do share data, because it is difficult and it is complex. So, I mean, as a starting point to say, like, the European Union doesn't have a role per se in healthcare, health management. That is a matter for the member states, and it's really coveted and it's protected. I don't think many member states don't want the European institutions wandering into dictating their healthcare.
Research is a European capacity. Correct me if I'm wrong. Research you do have is
absolutely, and with the new Horizon 2020, the new EU research program, we've just agreed that for the next 7 years. So that's really important, and what European Union supports. I think that there's a really strong role to play there, and we hear a lot of talk now that the European Union can play a strong role in collaborating, in ensuring that, you know, if there is research going across EU member states, particularly maybe even funded by European Union taxpayers' money, that there should be a means of collaborating, coordinating, because the sum of the various parts is a greater whole, and that's the objective. So there is a role for European Union there in terms of, as I say, coordinating, supporting research projects, and in a cross-border manner. That's really strong. We've seen it. I suppose if you look back to the last 12 months and the role that the European Union played in the COVID and dealing with the crisis there. Initially, in terms of procuring PPE was the first emergency, and then realising that we didn't have structures in place really to act as one unit, and then moving to purchase vaccines on behalf of the union, for the union as a whole. So there is a coordinating role, supporting role that the European Union can play in the whole area of healthcare.
Okay, I'm looking at questions coming in on our interactive platform. Some of us are a bit competitive and asking about who's ahead of this game. I know you will probably tell me that it really depends what kind of brain research we're talking about, as Professor Knudsen was saying. But I see one question about Europe compared to the rest of the world, and another one within Europe. Which countries? Does it make sense to speak about research in terms of macro level of countries, or is it really about individuals who are excelling in different places? Or does it really depend on which kind of brain research we're talking about? Whoever wants to jump in. I think the viewers want to hear that we Europeans are doing best, but yes, please, Paweł.
If I can say something, because one of the reasons why Ebrains was created was precisely because different countries in Europe specialize in different things. So the brain atlases, neuromorphic computing, you can see a lot of that in Germany. Belgium is very good in clinical neuroscience. Switzerland and France in brain simulation. Norway and Greece do great data curation. But nobody does everything at once. So one of the reasons why we thought Ebrains is necessary is to bring all these skills together. Now, when you look at this from the global perspective, it's really the European Union and the United States which weigh most heavily in brain research. But this is becoming a more and more populated field. China launched its Brain Research Institute in 2018, so just 3 years ago. Japan is quite strong. So for the moment, it's really the transatlantic duo that leads. But we should watch very carefully what happens in other places of the world, because I think brain will be one of the biggest areas in the future. Also because it remains largely unexplored. A lot of fantastic progress has been made, but some of the key discoveries are still ahead of us. Now, you can get either depressed with that finding, or you can get fascinated and thrilled by it. It's your choice. I think it's entirely thrilling that the next...
There's more territory to discover, you're telling us. It hasn't been done yet.
Maybe I can chip in. I think I wouldn't see this as a competition between countries. I mean, think about the corona pandemic. The corona pandemic has united countries. It's also separated them to some extent. But I mean, we have a joint enemy here. Now, we also have a joint challenge with brain disorders. So I would welcome any country that could make a contribution. But what I think is really important for Europe is to acknowledge that unless we take a big part in this, then we will be left behind, because that's what we know from everything that we know points at. Well, if you are not part of the development, you will be left behind, and the implementation of new findings will be delayed. So we need to be a strong partner, but I would be very happy if we could also share data with our colleagues across the world. I think in Europe we have some special issues with the GDPR that prevents us from sharing those data, and we need to find good solutions for that. And that's why a platform like Ebrains could also be quite instrumental in making solutions where we can make sure that we keep privacy and yet we can still share our data and experiences in a good way.
Yeah, so the good news is that we heard from Paweł earlier. Sorry, I will let you in a moment. The good news that we heard from Paweł that there are global aspirations to go beyond Europe. So maybe data will come from other places. But I find it really fascinating that GDPR applies even to big data of brain research. So I'm very glad that you, Member of Parliament Knudsen, want to jump in, because really, even on that kind of scientific data, GDPR applies, and we have to be that careful.
Yeah, and this is an issue that's come up in a lot of discussions recently, and there is a new Data Governance Act to be produced or to be published that we've been working with. But we've had a number of reports in Parliament recently about data, and we want to, the overwhelming majority of Parliament want to ensure that we can share data and ensure free flow of data that's not personal. Remove the identity element from it, personal identity, and they can share it cross border and share internationally, because it makes obvious sense if you can share that. And also in the area of AI, artificial intelligence, that too is on the agenda, and you know the strong role it can play there in healthcare, recognizing that there are risks and there's going to be a lot of concerns around that, but it can really play a really strong role in healthcare, particularly in an area like this where you've got such a complex set of inputs. AI can play a strong role there. So Professor is right. There is an issue about data and sharing it in the health area, but we want to see it. We want to see GDPR addressed so we can share non-personal information.
But the solution from what you're telling us sounds quite simple.
It does,
the solution
yeah.
sounds simple. By anonymizing it, you basically turn it GDPR friendly.
Yeah, exactly. Anonymizing it, and therefore, but then there's a concern that can be de-anonymized. So you've always got to be. That's another. Yeah. It can be, but I think we see most people want a sensible approach here. Absolutely, if you're a 50-year-old woman and you have certain backgrounds, certain your issues, it should be shared. The reason the reason that you are in this position with a mental disease, mental health issue, that can be shared internationally and to produce better outcomes. Absolutely.
And I would assume that this question about anonymized data when it comes to any kind of medical research is not specific to the brain. I suppose that it came up when it came to the coronavirus, or this is an issue of privacy versus medical research in general.
Medical advancement, yeah, absolutely. And I think it makes sense, absolutely. Share the information and remove the elements that can identify the individual for whatever subject. If it is, as you say, in COVID, cancer care, for any health area, it absolutely makes sense. We have to do that.
So once again, we have the challenge, but we know what the solution is, so that gives some hope. There's an interesting question that came also through one of the viewers, who is asking whether the fact that now we are advancing with 3D mapping, we can now identify exactly which parts of the brain are linked to a certain disorder. And then he or she is jumping ahead. It's anonymous. No, sorry, it's Peter Morrison, so it's a he. Whether we can cure it without medication. In other words, once we identify exactly the source of a certain disorder, I think here he was referring to more of a psychiatric disorder, whether the solution would not necessarily be by prescribing medication is mostly the case today. Would that change, understanding better the source, the exact place in the brain where the disorder comes from? Would that mean that the solution is not necessarily through prescribing medication, if I understand the question correctly?
Yeah.
Does any of you have... It's quite a specific question, but...
I can address that. So it's of course true that many brain disorders like depression are solved through medication. But neurotechnology is also offering targeted approaches. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So one of them is the Parkinson's disease. That's the disease where people become stiff and have all kinds of tremors. So that is can be treated by putting an electrode, basically a wire, to a particular structure in the brain and putting a little bit of current on it. So that alleviates many of the symptoms. Something similar is now happening for epilepsy. So there are already companies who create also an interface with a specific structure in the brain. And that is where you need to really know the mapping of all the brain areas. So if then an epileptic attack starts, that's detected, and then quickly it's stopped by stimulating at the right position. And so I think there Europe can start to play an important role. I think this is the time where those developments are going to be increasingly produced. So I foresee an ecosystem of new companies, and some of these companies already exist, of course, in the US. And I think that Europe can also play an important role there, but it's also related to the investor climate in Europe, which is not matching the one in the US. So I think there's work for us to do.
But forgive my ignorance, why is it necessarily better to stimulate the brain rather than to give medication? Why is that? I mean, would there be less side effects by a stimulation which is not medical?
Yes.
Or
so
a drug?
Some brain disorders, if you really know where the source of the problem is, for instance, in the case of epilepsy, then drugs, they typically target all brain cells at the same time. So then you have a lot of side effects because you're also treating parts of the brain that are not contributing to the disease. So in some situations, definitely not in all situations, in some situations, if you can solve the problem locally by putting an interface at that location, you're given basically a better cure.
Okay, another question that came in, which brings us slightly away from research, but maybe more policy making. Somebody's asking whether policymakers place enough emphasis on preventive measures such as exercise, diet, good sleep, hygiene, etc. So I guess that's for you, Member of Parliament Kroon. Of course, when it comes to health, there's a whole range of things you can do other than brain research, but is there a role for Europe to prevent, I mean, let's bring it back to brain, to prevent brain-related diseases through preventive measures?
Well, I think there is a role in terms of identifying what could be best practice, what could be recommended in this area. I mean, and I know the experts will speak better to this than I will, but I'm just thinking of the whole area of cancer has been mentioned, and we're preparing a cancer plan at the moment from the Commission. They produced their Beating Cancer strategy, and lifestyle is very much a part of that, and prevention is a huge emphasis of it. Prevention, lifestyle, alcohol, tobacco, that environment, and it was mentioned at the beginning of the session as well that prevention is so much better than the cure, as we do know, and that if there is a role for Europe in developing or helping to develop best practice and supporting member states in implementing healthcare measures in their individual country.
Okay, I'm looking now at the ideas, and I see that our viewers are actually quite proactive. They're not just asking you questions, but they also have a lot of ideas. We won't have time to go over all of them, but I invite the four of you panelists to maybe after this session also to have a look at some of the ideas. One that caught my eye comes from a gentleman called Pieter, who's asking about private-public partnerships. So we spoke a lot about Europe as an institution funding research. We spoke about Ebrains, which is funded by the EU, if I understand correctly, that brings researchers together. But where's the role of the private sector or private companies? I think you, Professor Roelfsema, mentioned some American examples, which I would assume some of them are actually privately funded. But here in Europe, would you say, do you have interesting examples of where private companies come into this this play of research of the brain?
So many of the companies I have in mind are indeed based in the US. So there's several examples. I already mentioned the new company called Neuralink by Elon Musk. So they aim to create interfaces with the brain that have many channels. So basically allow for high density reading and writing. In Europe, there are definitely a number of companies that make similar technology. So one of them is, for instance, Cortec in Freiburg, and I'm sure there's a whole list of these companies. And therefore, I think this is a good time for Europe to also make sure that these companies can flourish, so that we in Europe can have a matching network of companies.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, the comparison to COVID is too easy to avoid, but here we did see the role of pharmaceutical companies who invested, of course, with support of institutional support, but were investing in themselves in order to speed up the progress on that. I don't know, Paweł, if you want to bring some examples. Yes? Sorry, go ahead, Professor Knudsen.
I think Europe has a very strong medicinal industry as well. And there is a lot of collaboration between the industry and the clinical settings. So as a medical doctor, you need to be involved in the research and vice versa. So that's completely instrumental that we have good working relationships with the pharma industry.
Absolutely. Maybe, Paweł, if you have interesting examples from your platform of successful collaborations between research and private. I'm putting you on the spot here, but I mean, I don't know if it's something that comes to your mind that you can mention.
Yes, I think Europe is already big and will be bigger, but a little bit sort of more under the radar than what we see in the United States. I think there is less hype around neurotechnology in Europe, but it's growing in a very healthy way. And in fact, if you look up the Financial Times Sifted article in November last year, it argued that neurotechnology in Europe is bigger and more promising than in the US. I mean, we always love these comparisons. But what is really happening is that we have a
especially when they're on our side. Yeah.
Yes, we have a mixture of invasive and non-invasive methods. I think there is probably more focus on invasive in the United States, but a huge potential in neuroengineering, in brain stimulation, deep brain stimulation that goes back to the 1980s already. That exists in neurorehabilitation as well for patients who have suffered from stroke. But you ask a very important question. So how does business and academia work together? And here it is worth to draw inspiration from the US, because in many US programs it is a must that a private company participates in research bids. And a similar setup would of course be extremely interesting in Europe as well. We ourselves have just opened up the Human Brain Project Consortium to several private partners. So that's the first time in our 8-year history that this is happening. So we are cooperating very closely. And I'm quite convinced that we will also build a platform for working together with neurotechnology companies. So this is an exciting phase when a lot of commercialization will happen. We should have in the Human Brain Project some startup announcements in the coming months as well, which is a natural evolution. You do the science first, and then once the science matures, you can think of successful commercialization. But neurotechnology generally will be a massive market in the years to come.
Interesting.
Fantastic. We're getting some questions that I thought would come actually earlier, more about the kind of sci-fi implications that your research might have. So I have to say that I was surprised when I was preparing for this conversation, because I thought that we were advancing at the speed of light with new discoveries every day, and that very soon we'll be living in some science fiction film where we can already copy the brain and connect it to the internet and all sorts of things that we've seen in some popular science, or science fiction productions recently. So we have some questions about how close we are. For example, somebody asked about increasing to over 100% eyesight, etc. But I'm also wondering if you and your peers are already wondering about some of the crazy ethical questions about, where we have to stop, where are we going too far? Or is this not something, this is more for popular science and not for real science to address at this point at least? Do you feel like we're not that close to putting my brain on a USB stick yet?
Yeah, I can say something about that.
Yeah.
So,
please.
This is the right time to address the ethical questions, for sure. And the Human Brain Project is strong in this. The reason is that we are still, several years, probably several decades from getting an interface with the brain that would give a form of eyesight that is superior to normal, because the technology is still somewhat rudimentary. We're putting wires in the brain, and for now we can maybe put 1,000, 10,000. You have to realize that the optic nerve, so the cable that comes from the eye to the brain, has 1 million, right? So we are still at best at 1% of that. Now, before we are thinking of matrix-like scenarios where you can upload and download brain programs, this will probably not take place during my lifetime, is my prediction. But of course, we are going in this direction. Now, the scientists now are really focusing on disease, right? Alleviating problems in people with severe handicaps caused by the brain, like blindness, like epilepsy, like Parkinson's disease. At some point, maybe if you can do neurotechnology for Alzheimer's, that would be fantastic. It's not known if that will work. Now, if you are then thinking further ahead, 100 years from now, where you really would be able to interface with the brain at a much finer scale and really writing and reading brain codes at a much finer scale, then of course we need this ethical framework in place. So this is the right moment to think about it. So for instance, would you like it if somebody else accesses what you think? Well, I wouldn't, because sometimes I think
it depends who it is.
I think I have thoughts that I really like to keep private, right? So and there are these privacy matters. There's also the matter of who controls me, right? So if you would have a system in place that has influence on what you're going to choose, that better be governed by a very solid ethical framework. So we're not yet there, and it will take many years, but And it's actually a very good time to start thinking about it.
It's already inspiring filmmakers. Does it inspire, exactly when I wanted to turn to you, does it inspire policymakers? Do you already ask yourself these questions of, do we need to start regulating this, or is it too far away?
Oh no, you absolutely, we're asking those questions, and those questions are always there. Do we regulate? We have to regulate, but at the same time there's a balance, and you have to give science the space, because if we don't support science and research, then we won't provide answers to all these challenging questions. So yeah, I mean, I think, and going back to my input there on artificial intelligence, we're having this discussion at the moment. How do we oversee it? How do we ensure that there are, the structures in place? If there's particularly we want trustworthy human oversight, I think is going to be really important in this, and of course ethical. But one man's ethics isn't somebody else's ethics, so there's that challenge as well. So these are all the challenges, but most definitely there will be a demand as well when it comes to from the public for some form of oversight or framework within which these can operate. I think that's important. That's going to be important. At the moment, as I said, we're dealing with disease and very challenging situations for humans, for individuals. But where does it go, and where do you stop, and will robots take over the world is the concern at the moment. Not a concern, but it's a question.
So just to understand, so this is a debate that's already taking place within the walls of the European Parliament. You're already asking yourself, or is it too soon?
It's that the debate as regards healthcare. No, it's not too soon. But it's not too soon, and we need to have that. It is absolutely discussed in reports and discussions on oversight, ethical framework.
I'm referring to maybe letting science go too far, letting scientists maybe understand the brain too well to be able to, some of the ideas that we just heard are not going to happen within a few years, but copying, planting ideas, connecting privacy of our own thoughts, etc. Is that something that policymakers are already thinking about, or does science need too much time for you to actually worry about these questions?
No, those kind of concerns are always there, aren't they? I mean, when we talk of science, they're always there, and I think they need to be not controlled. Is probably too long a word, but an understanding of what's happening and what the limits are and what society will accept. But today's society will be different in 20 years' time, so it needs to be flexible as well. It's not a black and white situation. These things involve a lot of discussions and consultation, and what will be acceptable. For instance, I think if we talk of artificial intelligence, you're building in bias now today, or you're building in ideas, or what's the norms that's accepted in society. But they weren't there 20 years ago, the approaches we have. So it's you have to be flexible and conscious that you're dealing with something that's constantly evolving and constantly changing.
Professor Knudsen, could this kind of bias in artificial intelligence, you mentioned big data before, do you think that you could be a victim of your own aspiration to get more data, of getting biases kind of enshrined? Because I've done a few events on AI, and something that always comes up is that at some point we may not understand the results anymore. So, for our viewers, to simplify very much, you take a lot of data, you find patterns. Sometimes we don't understand those patterns, but we understand that there is something in the correlation there. So do you see already a risk that by getting a lot of data you would understand, you would see trends, you would see certain phenomena, but you would not be able to explain them, so we would kind of lose control of where your research is going?
Yeah, what you're mentioning here is a very important danger with AI, and I think the only way to really cope with that danger is to get more data, so that we can replicate what we have. Because exactly as you say, if you have a lot of data, you can find many associations that are just coincidence findings, and that's why we need to replicate science. And it sounds boring, because it's always more exciting to do new discoveries and to publish new discoveries. But at some point, I think we have to reconsider again how we do science and how it is rewarded. What are the incentives for scientists today? And I think there should be incentives for scientists that share their data and that do replication work. Because otherwise we end up with a series of news where half of them have to be retracted afterwards. So that's the danger of AI, but I think it's also an opportunity. And if we do have enough data, we will be able to replicate the true findings.
So by replicating, you're saying basically to review or do a similar study to what has already been done in order to reaffirm the findings, basically.
Yeah. Exactly, to confirm what was found in the first place.
But very interesting
If
idea
it
of
is a true
rewarding
finding-
scientists for sharing their data. Sorry?
Yes, exactly. So we need to have some incentives for that. So the way it works now for scientists is to publish well and have exciting data to present, and that is that's fine, you know. But it also shows we know that many major publications need later to be retracted because they cannot be replicated. And that leads to a lot of waste, I would say, because a lot of scientists run in that direction to pick up the finding or to follow up on it. They can't replicate it, and then it's not
Because
quite
the data
as
is not
exciting
available.
to publish. Well, maybe data are available, but you have your own data, and your own data look different from the ones that were published. Right. And then you wonder if you made a mistake or if the others made a mistake. But sometimes it's just coincidence that you make an observation that cannot be replicated. So replication, so we have firm ground on our feet, so we know what the observations are. That is really key for progress of science.
Okay, we're running out of time, but I'd like to finish the cycle and bring it back to you, Paweł. Maybe a few ideas about the next steps of where we're going with the Ebrains platform. What can we expect in the years to come?
Well, our main objective is to become a reference infrastructure for brain science. So we would like to have as much work being done on the platform and in collaboration with the platform. But I think we also need to have bigger ambitions in Europe. And let me mention two ideas here. One has to do with data that I think has been throughout our discussion pretty much the main subject. And it's clear that there is that challenge of fragmentation of data in neuroscience as well. People work on their data set, so to say. They exchange among themselves, but there is nothing of large magnitude, which would enable going to scale, which would enable also.
And the Ebrains project is there to solve exactly that.
So we need something bigger.
That's one of the something bigger.
We need something bigger. We have called this the Brain Health Data Space. So a project that would belong to what is on the agenda of the European Union, that wants to create the European Health Data Space. We need something like that in the area of brain, because the fragmentation has to be urgently overcome. And perhaps since cancer was mentioned a few times, and there is a mission cancer among 5 which are currently the basis for the next few years. I think in the next few years we should think about mission brain in order to bring the developments together in brain medicine, but also in brain-inspired computing, and in our understanding of the brain, because after all, the brain is pretty much who we are. We do differ from animals by virtue of thought and language. It's our intelligence that makes us different. Otherwise, we are not faster runners or better swimmers. We can't really fly on our own. So it's our intelligence that makes us human. And I think it does deserve this particular approach as a mission, as a challenge for the years to come in many different disciplines.
True.
Okay, with that in mind, all 4 of you have very interesting projects ahead of you and big ambitions for the years to come. Unfortunately, we'll have to close the discussion here. So let me just once again thank our 4 panelists, Professor Knudsen, Professor Roelfsema, Member of Parliament Kroon, and Director General Świeboda. Let me also thank you, our viewers, for recognizing the importance of brain research by registering, viewing, and participating so actively in this debate. I only got a glimpse of what you sent in. I hope you've enjoyed this and learned something new. I can tell you I definitely have. That's why I keep doing these webinars. Our next event will be on climate research and space, next Wednesday, 2:30 Brussels Times, on the Brussels Times, on the website and on the Facebook page. For myself, Dan Sobovitz, and the entire team, I wish you all a wonderful evening and goodbye.